Hi, today I'm going to talk about how I took this $50 table I bought on Amazon and turned it into a custom table featuring my favorite skin from Fortnite, Fishstick. Hi, welcome to Gray Lightning, my video blog about making things and playing games. And my project for today is this custom hand-painted fish stick table. Now, Fishstick in Fortnite is kind of a love 'em or hate 'em character, but I really love him. And that's good because I spent about 10 hours looking at him as I worked on this project. I used this very same table in an earlier project where I did a resin tabletop, but this looks entirely different. First of all, because I primed it all black before I started. And then, of course, I've hand-painted all the main surfaces. The top, the shelf, and the legs. I did those designs in Adobe Illustrator. And then I used those Illustrator drawings to drive the laser cutter at my local makerspace. Now, this was still all in pieces. I assembled it as my last step. So I was able to lay them in the bed of the laser cutter and engrave. And what I would do is I would mask each surface with either masking paper or masking tape, and then I would engrave the design in it. That allowed me then to peel away sections of the design as I painted color by color. And then finally, the last step is to peel away all the lines themselves, and that leaves you with the black line that you see because you can see through to the primer underneath. So I'm going to talk about how I did all of this in this episode. There's a furniture company called Sticks, and their style is really the inspiration for this project. They do hand-painted furniture with black outlines, and that's really the effect I want to go for here. The process I have in mind will require double lines where the black lines are, and this lets the masking stay in place while I paint around it. I've decided the best way, the easiest way to get this to happen is to do a fat black line drawing, then run it through the image trace function in Illustrator, and that will outline the black line. And when I remove the fill, I'm just left with the two lines on either side. So now the question is, what's the easiest way to get a simple line drawing of Fishstick? If I can turn this color screenshot of Fishstick into a clean black and white image, I may be able to run image trace on that. So I spent about an hour using all the tricks I knew how to do to turn it into a clean black and white image suitable to use in the image trace function. I tried using different modes, different filters. I did it manually by selecting colors and replacing them with black and white. And this is the best I could come up with. I tried again. I used different approaches. And like I said, this is still the best I could do. Better, but still not good enough. There's way too much noise in this picture for it to work in image trace. So I knew at this point I was going to have to draw it from scratch in Illustrator. I could place that screenshot in Illustrator and use it as a reference photo, but pretty much I was going to have to draw everything with the pen tool. So I set it to a color, this pink here, that it's easy to see over the reference image, and you just click around and go back and select those points with the direct selection tool and turn it to smooth. And you get a first version of the curves, and then you grab the handles and you stretch them and you make it fit the photo underneath. It's a pretty labor-intensive process. There are a few places where you can use the predefined shapes like circles and draw some circles and then copy and paste those in. And this is a little faster, but there aren't a lot of opportunities to use that in an image like Fishstick. It took me a couple of hours to come up with this version. This is, though, a vector drawing, which means I can select all the lines and turn them to 3 points, and that's what makes them a uniform thickness. But these are still single lines. To turn them into double lines, I have to export this as an image, and I save it as a PNG, and then I pull that image back into a new layer of Illustrator. I place it. Now I can run the image trace on it. With the image selected, you tell it to run image trace and you say make, which basically starts the process. You can open up an image trace window that has a lot of settings that you can play with to try to clean up a less than optimal black and white image. But in this particular case, it's so clean, it came from my own vector drawing. I can just say, show me the outlines. And if I zoom in, I can see I've got exactly what I want, a line on either side of the black line. You finish up by saying expand, and that tells it to go ahead and produce it. You turn the fill to none. I set the lines to blue, which is engraving for my laser cutter. Now the hardest part is done, but I want to put some things around fish sticks, so I find some black and white clip art for some seaweed shells and a starfish. And then I get the dimensions of all the surfaces I want to engrave, and I create to scale drawings of the top. The green rectangle is the outline of the top, and I use the black and white images for all the pieces. I do the same thing for the shelf, and I run these to scale size images through the image trace, and I get my final cut files. So here's the top, here's the shelf, and I've decided to only paint the two outer sides of each leg. So I'm going to lay the four legs next to each other, engrave them all at once, and then just roll them over to the second side and engrave again. But before I can do anything, I need to prime all the pieces, so I sprayed on a high-quality black primer. I decide to use the shelf as kind of my test piece, and I engrave it through the masking paper, and I peel away the star to see if it's really cutting through the paper well, and it was. So this is actually real time. This is the speed of the laser engraving. Engraving is much faster than cutting the wood. And here's the finished top. And then finally, to do the legs, I really use my clamps to line everything up, put the four legs in. I engrave the first side of the legs. And because I've got the clamps, I can then just flip them over inside the clamps, rerun the same program, it's still lined up, and I engrave the second side. I'm using a low-tack masking tape on the legs, and here they are finished. So now I'm ready to paint, and my process here is basically I pick a color for something, I peel away those parts, and I paint them. When all the elements on a particular item are finished, then I peel away the background and paint the background. The final step is to peel away the masking from the lines themselves. I go through the same process on the legs. Here's my helper inspecting my handiwork after I've painted the seaweed, and then I peel away the background. I'm going to paint a brighter blue now because I want more contrast against the black lines. And then finally, when I pull off the lines themselves, here's how it looks. Peeling up the masking can be kind of a delicate process. I used an X-Acto knife and, when necessary, tweezers to pull up exactly the parts I wanted and to leave the lines down in place. This would be much more difficult if I hadn't used a low-tack adhesive. Here's the top. Just before I peel off the lines, you can see my reference photo above that I'm using for my coloring. And here it is with the black lines revealed. Here are all of the components, and they're ready for their coats of high-quality varnish. This is a comparison of the screenshot to the final top. It's not perfect, but I was happy with the results, and to get this level of results, you really need to know a few tips and tricks. The first is to use a very high-quality paint. I use Citadel paints that I use for my miniature painting, and these are the base colors I used. Base paints are essential for getting coverage over black paint. I used a couple of pre-mixed layer paints for my second and third layers, but mostly I mixed my own. For many of the colors I used, I would make a small amount of a shade by adding a little bit of black, a small amount of highlight by adding a little bit of white, and sometimes I would make a glaze by adding an clear acrylic glazing medium that doesn't change the color, it just makes it more transparent. So let me show you a couple of examples of how I use these. First of all, I didn't try to hide my brush strokes, especially in the background. Letting the strokes show is really a part of that sticks look that tells you that it's hand-painted. I used two different greens for this seaweed from this version of the seaweed. This is a subtle difference. It doesn't show very well in this lighting, but it does help add a little interest to an otherwise plain picture. I used the highlight and shading on the hat, and this pattern on the bandana is actually a highlight version of the bandana color. I did a lot of highlighting and shading on the orange. So here under the hand and inside the arm and the rounding of the face. After I did that, though, I thought it looked a little too stark, so I put a glaze of orange over everything to kind of mellow it out. There's a patch of highlighted scales on his face, and I did that with a little bit of white in the glazing medium. I used a little brown glaze on the gills, and I did a shade version of the vest color, and I used it to do some trim and the space under his arm. I used some brown glaze and a very small brush to make a little bit of a scale pattern on his arm. I did shading on his leather belt under the different pouches. And Citadel makes really wonderful metallic paints, and I used that on the metal components of his belt. I've got several different browns in his pants, totally different base colors in these two sections here, and then a highlight on the edge. The great thing about acrylic paints is if you really don't like something, you can paint over it and do it again. My table can't really compete with a sticks table, but a sticks table is $1,000, and mine costs $50 and about 10 hours of effort. And hey, it's fish stick. You can use the same technique to paint something you love. I have lots of other projects for gaming and gamers. If you're interested, please subscribe to my channel.